Welcome to the Manual Channel. I'm your host, Dan Gall, and today I have the honor of speaking with Martin Markvardsen. By the way, did I say that correctly?
You said that very, very nicely.
Awesome. I'm so happy. He's the senior global brand ambassador for Highland Park Whiskey with over 2 decades in the whiskey industry and a fascinating background as a Danish boxing champion. I definitely want to learn more about that. Martin brings a wealth of experience and passion to the world of single malts. So join us as we explore the storied history of Highland Park, discuss its latest endeavors, and get to know the man behind the brand. Stay tuned because we'll also be tasting three of their exceptional whiskeys, the 12-year, 15-year, and 18-year expressions throughout our conversation. So let's go. Martin, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm fine, and thank you for having me. It's getting close to Christmas. That means off for a few days, but it's been a very, very busy year. Good visit to US as well earlier this year, and going back next year. In general, just a fantastic year for Highland Park and myself. So I'm not the one to complain.
That's great to hear. When you come to the US, where do you normally come to? What area of the US are you visiting?
We are going quite a lot to California at the moment. Seattle has been there. Texas, we're in Denver last time I was there as well. But San Francisco, San Diego, San Jose, Seattle was part we visited last time, and then Denver. And I think April, May would be Seattle again, and then LA. And that's basically the launch of what we're going to talk a little bit about of the new pack as well. So yeah, it's always good to come back to US and really looking forward to come back to show them the new packaging as well and dial down the Viking theme a bit as well.
Oh wow! Okay. We're gonna dig into that a little bit later, but I will say I'm very partial to Seattle because I'm from the Seattle area, and I'm still on the West Coast. I love the West Coast, so it's pretty cool that you come here. Next time you come, hook me up, and I'd be happy to also, if you have time, show you around at least maybe Seattle or down in Portland, which is where I'm at. It's about a 2.5 hour drive.
Would love that. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to dig in first a little bit about you go from boxing to whiskey. I know there's quite a journey there and an interesting story. One cool thing, every year in Portland during a certain part of the year, there's a restaurant here that's known for doing a boxing kind of setup between Irish boxers and US like Golden Glove boxers. And
Right.
yeah, it's for St. Patty's Day. If you're ever interested, that might be a fun thing to go see too for you. But tell me a little bit about your transition from being a Danish boxing champion, which I have never met a boxing champion in my life, so I'm excited for this, to a leading figure in the whiskey industry. That's a super intriguing story, very unique. Can you share kind of how that journey unfolded?
Yeah, so back in the days and many pounds ago, when I was lighter in weight as well, I did a lot of boxing, became Danish champion 2 times, had 25 international fights on the national team. I lost 8 fights out of 72 fights. It was quite good. Unfortunately, I had a car accident and got quite a big bruise up here that always, when I took on the gloves again and went into the ring, always kind of broke up and made me think about it. And I stopped boxing, started doing powerlifting instead from that. And then I was asked to come into the Danish Navy, went into the Danish Navy, and of course brought the boxing in there as well. And it was actually on a trip while I was in the Danish Navy that brought us to Edinburgh on an exercise for 2 weeks. And during the 2 weeks, they gave us one day off in Edinburgh. And where all my colleagues wanted to go pub crawling, I rented a car and went on sightseeing. When you go around Scotland, it's very, very hard not to bump into a distillery. And eventually I bumped into a distillery and was extremely fascinated about everything. And it was not because I didn't didn't like whiskey that much at that time, probably because I didn't taste the right ones. I became very fascinated about the whole culture about it, most of all the stories, but also how proud the guys working at the distillery were about their brand. And it was like, when we talked about them, said, well, my brand is like, boom. This is when I was 20 years old. So that's 37 years ago. And I knew that I wanted to know everything about whiskey, and I think the dedication I've had from boxing and later in the military took me on that ride where I said, it was kind of, I wouldn't give up until I knew as much as possible. At that time in Denmark, there was basically only one or two whiskey books, and that was just about tasting notes, not really about stories and production. So the only way I could learn about it was actually to move back to Scotland, and that's what I did. So I went back to Scotland and started working on different distilleries, and at that time they were quite opened arms when you came, because if you told them that you would work for free or come in, they're Scottish, so everything that was free, fantastic. So gave me a chance to work from everything in the warehouse, rolling in the cask, to production, distilling, everything there, fermentation, which was one of the things that I really, really enjoyed a lot to see transformation from a beer later to a spirit and these kind of things. And then later got the opportunity to work with guys like Jim McEwen at Bowmore Distillery and Briglatic and so on, and learn the art of blending as well. It's been a really fascinating transformation from being a boxer, using some of the skills in the dedication you have, and always want to be the best, and to take that into the whiskey world. It's about get as much information as I can, but use it. So for the first couple of years, I was just starting up my own company called Whiskey Consulting, where I was actually giving consultancy work for the Danish importers. Started up a few whiskey shops, and became the chief buyer for World of Whiskies in Copenhagen Airport, until I was asked to come to Scotland and work at the world famous Craigellachie Hotel as a whiskey manager, doing all their tastings, be responsible for the range of the whiskies in the bar. And when I left, we had 784 different single malts in the bar, and I needed, to be a whiskey manager, I needed to know about each and every bottle, and also do tastings. But most of all, I had to do quality control every month. Yeah, which was fantastic. So it was one of these things where I learned a lot, and because that was kind of a showroom for most of the Scottish distilleries, they all invited me to come and see the distilleries. So within a couple of years while working there, I visited every Scottish distillery and did tastings with basically everything. And it was about there where I really fell in love with Highland Park. I came up to Orkney to see it, doing my kind of work at a Craigellachie Hotel and so on, and also worked there for a week. But it was the fascination about Orkney, but also the whiskies that really captured me at that time, and I fell in love with Highland Park. So at one time, a group came over to Craigellachie Hotel for a whiskey dinner, and I did the presentation for them, and I had the Highland Park 18 there, and said, "This is my favorite whiskey." And they all looked at me. I had no idea where they're from. I just talked to them like, they had no idea about whiskies. It went well, and said, "Thank you very much." And it was fantastic. And then a few weeks later, they called me and said, "Oh, I'm coming back with a new group. Can you do another tasting? But please use some other whiskies." And I, of course, chose other whiskies except from Highland Park 18. And same story. This is my favorite whiskey. And then I think 2 weeks later, they called me and said, "Do you want to be our ambassador for Highland Park?" Yeah. And without knowing it, it was the guys from Edmonton Group. So yeah. So it was. It was a bit of luck, and for me, it's never, being an ambassador, global ambassador for Highland Park, it's never been considered as a work, because it's my hobby, and I still, to this very day, after working 19 years for Highland Park and 35 years in the industry, it's still my hobby, and I still love each and every bit of it, and that's why, if I can talk just 5 minutes about whiskey, I'm the most happy person in the world. So yeah, so that's kind of my journey to where I am today, global ambassador. Yeah.
Fascinating story, and thank you for sharing that. It's you hit on a couple things. One, the first thing was you were never a fan or passionate about whiskey at first, and part of that was because you didn't know. It sounded like I'm paraphrasing here, but you didn't know what to drink or hadn't explored that. And I find that to be a very. I went through the same thing. I find that to be a very common scenario, not just with whiskeys, but I would say in general with alcohol, beer. Whatever. So I would love to dig into that a little bit. The other thing is everybody in the industry that I talk to, brand ambassador, distillers, blenders, they have that same passion. And it just honestly, it makes me jealous in the terms of what it's the true loving what you do, right? And it just is so fascinating to hear that and how close everybody seems to be within the industry. So it's amazing.
Yeah, then first of all, I don't think you have to be a really, really good actor if you're going to do this job without having a passion for it. I travel close to 200 days a year around the world. Of course, when you do presentation, the presentation is very much the same. You can't change the story. You can't change the production. That's the same. For me, it's probably like being a rock musician, Bruce Springsteen, that are doing 3 hours concerts, 200 days a year, and it's the same repertoire, but it's the feedback from the audience, but also to I always say to deliver that gospel about Highland Park. I love doing, and as you say, I think every ambassador, everyone working in this fantastic industry, have the same feeling. And I can see that. And the fun thing is, people think we are competitors. Competition, when we talk about whiskey, I think will be between the marketing departments in the different companies. We are helping each other. Brand ambassadors around the world are sharing ideas, best practice. I've been, a few years ago, I was on a fair, and John Campbell from Lafroig got sick. And as I worked at Lafroig back in the days, he said, "Martin, can you do my presentation?" Even though I was working for Highland Park. And of course, I jumped right in and did 3 of his presentations because he couldn't participate in the fair. And I think that shows that we're all there for each other. And it's the same ambassadors that are global for the company. So no matter if I'm in Singapore, Taiwan, or whatever it can be, it's the family, because that's the guys we meet. So
Yeah.
that's how it is. It's best friends, it's family, and it's colleagues. So,
A
yeah.
lot of respect amongst each other. It's a community, right? Like,
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah.
yeah. I live in Portland and just right outside the wine country here, and it's the same thing here. Like,
Yeah.
the community is really strong amongst them. If somebody's having like an emergency, the other wineries and people that work, they all know each other. A very small community. They'll step up to help each other in time of need, advice, etc. So it's super fascinating from an outsider perspective to hear that, and thankful to be able to get an insight into that. So I do want to talk about tasting. So like the next, I have these 3 bottles. I have a 12-year, 15, and 18. I'm going to
Yes.
crack open this 12-year and do a quick tasting with you while we
Yeah.
talk a little bit
Definitely.
about
Yeah.
some other things. But I
Yeah.
would love, since you mentioned, not knowing, what to drink or how to drink, um, you know, truth be told, I have currently that experience with Scotch and Scottish whiskey. I definitely know like bourbon and American whiskey and so forth, but I have not had a ton of experience with Scotch whiskey, and I think it's the same thing. When I've been introduced to it in rare occasions, I'm like, ooh, I don't know what I'm tasting or the flavors, and I haven't properly gone through like a full tasting set. Other than one of the things I found really interesting is there's in Scottsdale, Arizona, there is a hotel that is based off of like a Scottish theme, I would say, but not like cheesy way. Very, very well done, and they have a bar in there that does with Scotch tastings. And I back then I learned about getting a little bit of the spirit on your hand through the dram, right? Doing this, burning off the alcohol, and that's the proper way of getting the nose. And I was blown away by that. So could you take me through how you think I should taste and experience at least these three that I have with you, and talk about the noses of each ones and the flavors and the taste, starting with this 12 year.
Yes. The thing about the one pouring the whiskey out in the hand, it's good for some reason. I would always do it on the palm of my hand, not in here, for different reasons. That if you have washed your hands, there'll always be rest of soap, and that's why when people warm up their whiskey, I would never put my hands on top of it, because it's alcohol that vapors and clean your hand. But pour a little bit on the palm of your hand, and you can then nose it and so on.
Do you recommend a wine glass? That was something else I picked up from somebody else with some American whiskey that's worked really well, or a dram.
Yes, that's the glass I have. That's the Glencairn glass, and that's really really nice to work with.
So pour a little bit. I'm hoping I don't pour it all over myself, but I honestly, I wouldn't mind if I did. I just don't want to blow up my computer. All right, so I got a little bit on the back of my hand.
So, and when you then rub it a bit, and the alcohol vapors because of the temperature from your skin, and actually leaves you with some of the flavors from the cask, from the peat, and so on. But it's not the right way to enjoy whiskey, because it will be a long night, and at the end of the night, if you go to a bar, you have no more body space. So it's good to have it in the glass as well.
Yeah.
But there's a few things. First of all, there are only two rules about how to drink whiskey. Rule number one is to forget about all the rules you have ever heard. And then rule number two is simply to enjoy it. Okay. But there's a few things that we as distillers always go through, and you'll see that clearly when you read books and so on. The first thing we always do is to take a good look at the color. The color in a whiskey is very, very important, because it tells you absolutely nothing. And the reason I'm saying that is because most of the whiskies in Scotland will have caramel added to it. And when caramel has been added to it, you can't really tell much about the color, because then the color had been adjusted.
Ah.
Most of the distilleries in Scotland, or a lot of the distilleries in Scotland, I would say, is still owned by foreign countries like France, like Italy, like Japan, and so on. And some of these distilleries will add caramel to the whiskey. Highland Park is still owned by Scottish people, and caramel costs money, so we don't use it. Of course, we are Scottish.
No additives.
Yeah, no. So when we know that, the color can always give you a hint of the type of cask. And for the difference between Scotch whiskey and bourbon, for instance, is that bourbon are using the cask ones, and it's American oak. In Scotland, we're using American oak and European oak predominantly that have been used before. If it's European oak, it will always give you a darker color. If it's American oak, a little bit paler, and then refill cask. Again, a difference between bourbon and Scotch whiskey, that in bourbon, you can only use the cask once, where in the whiskey industry, you can use them as many times as you want, as long as they give flavors to it. So when we do this, it's a hint, unless it's a single cask. Everything else will normally be mixed between American oak, European oak, refill cask. So it's definitely basically for the appetite. If it's a nice color, fine. The only thing is that you often see people going for a dark whiskey. It's very important to tell people that a dark whiskey is not always better than a pale whiskey. A dark whiskey is not older than a pale whiskey. A dark whiskey is dark, and that's it. Okay. so always just let the next part is the more important thing, and that's to nose it. How you nose your whiskey is a bit up to yourself, because people know better how their nose is working. But because all the whiskeys we're tasting is at least 40%, I will always start a little bit away from my nose and then get closer to it, so my nose kind of open up slowly. And when it's ready, sometimes I sound like a Hoover, and that's simply because I want to get everything in. And this is where you get the first impression of the whiskey, and you can find at least 32 different things using your nose. You can basically only taste 4. So your nose is the most important tool and is the first kind of idea about what your palate will meet. When we're going to taste the whiskey, it's a different story, because when I began working in the industry 35 years ago, I had a mentor, and he said, you need to show whiskey respect. So if it's 12 years old, keep it in your mouth for 12 seconds. If it's 18 years old, keep it in your mouth for 18 seconds.
Wow.
And so on. And I followed that rule for many years until I had a 64-year-old. Dan, I couldn't feel my mouth for a week. So just give it a few seconds in your mouth, let it go around, let the alcohol burn off a bit, and let your saliva do the rest with the whiskey. And let's see. So the first one we're going to taste here will be our 12-year-old. That was the first whiskey we launched as a core range, and that was in the late 1970s. So quite late for Highland Park, and it's a whiskey that bears everything we want from Highland Park. The DNA is here. Some sweetness. The sweetness will come basically from the peat we're using, a little bit from the casks as well.
Did you say the sweetness comes from the peat?
Yes. So and we come back to that a bit, because our peat is very different than the rest of Scotland. So basically, if you look at peat, there's different type of peat around Scotland, and it's built up. Peat is built up by plant material that's been decomposed through thousands of years. Could be trees, bushes, grass, flowers, all these kind of things. The only thing we have lots of in Orkney is heather. We don't have trees because of the wind. Trees can't survive. We don't have bushes, can't survive. So what we have plenty of is heather. And heather will give the honey floral flavor to a whiskey, even though the peat we're using is about 3,000 years old. Mm. So the sweetness will come from the heathery honey peat, of course, a bit from the cask as well. Mm. But for the nose, there's a bit of fruitiness coming out. The fruitiness will come from the casks and from the yeast. And then there's a touch of spice to it, vanilla as well, and that will be from the cask. The spiciness, the vanilla notes will come from the cask.
Does it matter, like breathing, like letting it breathe? Because I feel like, you know, I while you were talking, I didn't smell it for a bit, and when I went back, I was like, all of a sudden I got that whiff of sweetness, a lot stronger sweetness than like when I went back, like 10 seconds later.
When we're nosing whiskeys, first of all, the whiskey will stand for a while. It'll be 20% alcohol. We will dilute it down by water to open everything, but we also have our mouth open a bit. So when you actually nose it, the breathing in your mouth will allow the whiskey, while you're breathing, actually to get a little bit of oxidation as well. And that's releasing a bit more of the nose as well. There's more to it than just do it. But again, people have to do what they feel comfortable with. Mm-hmm. And the same with tasting notes. I found out when I traveled that when we're talking about flavors, and mostly when we talk about fruits, the way we have fruits in Europe that's been transported for thousands of miles basically to come to north part of Europe, compared to where it's fresh, like when we go to Asia or America and these kind of things, it's different flavors. So I remember here in Denmark when we launched the 15-year-old, I said also there's a hint of pineapple. When I mentioned that in Singapore, they all looked at me and said, have you ever tried a pineapple? So, yeah, well, and then I realized that when I taste pineapple over there, it's not the same nose. So there's different kind of things. So first impression by the nose. Let's give it a wee taste and see what you think. Okay. So. Let it go down slowly. And it's a very balanced whiskey. You know, it's there's a hint of smoke at the end, or peated flavor. It's not completely the same, but in this sense here, smoke, peat comes out. It's not a bonfire. It's far from it, but it's there just lingering in the back of your tongue. So very, very pleasant. if you don't like peated whiskey, I bet you will still like this because it's not heavily peated. And that's from our local peat in Orkney where we are located. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't get a ton of peat. I got it's I love this is what makes it so much fun doing a proper tasting is the experience like at least for me again Scotch whiskey the experience is something that it's hard for me to describe, right? I'm experiencing all these sensations and then as you talk through them just like the pineapple thing like the smell and the flavors that I get are probably similar but unique to myself and my own palate. But at least like you're saying, you get a little of the smoke on the back, right?
Yeah, yeah.
100%. Not a ton of peat. 100%. It makes me think more through it than just me trying to perceive it on my own. So thank you for that. And actually, it is not hot. It's very pleasant. The lingering flavor that I have on my tongue is up front. It's not in the back. It's a mixture. It's not super sweet like a bourbon,
No,
right? It's not like I'm getting, caramel, a ton of caramel or brown sugar or anything like that. It's more of a subtle, like I like to think of like from a heather perspective, it's almost kind of like if you've ever actually sucked on a honeysuckle and you get
yeah,
that
yeah,
really light sweetness that
yeah.
is clean. That's what I feel. A little clean, a little bit of oil, but it's a very light, subtle sweetness.
When I was a kid, you could buy kind of more malt bonbons, which you got mostly when you were sick because it lingered a bit. But it's some of the same sweetness you will get here. The honey notes compared to a lot of other whiskies is much more common here. The thing I like about Highland Park and still to this very day is that it kind of waters your mouth a bit after you let it go down. It kind of stays there for a while,
Hmm.
and there are more flavors coming up as you let it develop in your mouth a bit. So it's a whiskey, and then one thing you always need to know about any whiskies, whether it's bourbon or it's Scotch or Irish, a whiskey will develop in the cask or in the glass for a period of time. The older it gets, the more time you need to let it breathe in the glass. When I and we're going to taste the 18 later. When I taste my 18, it's in the glass for almost half an hour before I actually start drinking it. And that is simply to let it breathe, and it's like when you let Aladdin out, he needs to come out of to breathe as well, and that's the same with the whiskey. It's been locked in a bottle. Let it come out and get a bit of air before you attack it.
I didn't know that. Is that the same for something like the cast strength? Like, you all had the cast strength number 5 release this year. Would you do that as well with something that's stronger? And that's, I would imagine.
Yeah, I would say if you it's 64.7. If you pour it into the glass and you sip it right away, it's very, very strong. But if you give it 2 or 3 minutes, just 2 or 3 minutes, and let it kind of vapors a bit, you will see that's a big difference. And if you let it stay there for 15 minutes, completely different whiskies. So yeah.
Wow. I didn't know that. I was not aware of that. Um, Real quick, while I took a second sip of this because
Yeah,
I'm actually like the second one was even less burn. I wouldn't. There's not a lot of burn to this, but even the second time, and obviously the my mouth activating through this is amazing. I do want to hit real quick while we're doing this tasting. I want to talk about the Highland Park as the history. Like it's got rich history. It dates back to 1798. Um, what are some of the most significant milestones in that journey of history for Highland Park?
yeah. Well 1798 is it's a funny year because it was where Magnus Jørgensen got caught while distilling and had to pay a license. Of course, we can't write on the bottles that we were caught in 1798, so we transferred that into established. A different word from got caught, but that's how it all started. Magnus Jørgensen got caught in 1798 and was sentenced to pay a license, produced a few years, and then refused to pay his license. Got caught again in 1813 by John Robertson. and was sentenced to leave Orkney, not to go to jail, not to go to pay a license again. No, he was just sentenced to leave Orkney. Basically, the reason for that were that John Robertson's brother owned some land in Orkney up to Magnus' place, and they took over Magnus Distillery in 1816, together with a guy called Robert Berwick, that also was a custom and excise officer, and started producing in 1813, but didn't pay a license until 1826. So they distilled without a license themselves for 13 years.
Wow.
Then over the years, of course, the distillery expanded. We had 1887, Alfred Bernard, that wrote a book called The Distilleries of the United Kingdom, were there, and mentioned a few things that we're still working with today. First of all, he mentioned that we threw in fresh heather while we were drying the malt, but also, of course, the peat. And the fresh heather is something that we might think of doing again, but it's definitely some of the experiments we've done. So going back in time, going up through the years, 1937, taken over by Highland Distillers, that later became Edrington Group, that still owns it today. And then, of course, we had the first 50-year-old we launched back in days. Last year, we launched our 54-year-old for 225th anniversary. This year, we are launching the new packaging. So quite a good story. But if you go back to Magnus Jørgensen and you look at every other illegal or illicit distiller that started up in 1830s, whatever it could be at that time, and before 1824 and so on as well, he was different. He was not a farmer like most of them. He was actually a butcher. At that time, they were called a fletcher. And then at night, of course, he was smuggling and distilling illicit whiskey. But then every Sunday, he was working for the church. And working for the church in 1798, making whiskey illegally, not good, because whiskey back then was called the devil's dram. And Magnus, we know from old books, we've been reading that Magnus did not work for the church because he believed in God. Magnus worked for the church because he believed in whiskey, and he needed a place to hide it from the custom people. And custom and excise people back in the days were not really allowed to enter the church because they were the devil's men, the gouchers. So the best place for him to hide it was in the church, and he might as well just work for it while he was hiding his whiskey. So it was one of these things, when you came to the cathedral on a Sunday, he would be the one that will welcome you in, and he would show you your seats, probably give you the songbook, and help the minister or the priest by saying, please raise or set, or you should not kill, you should not steal, you should not make whiskey because that's illegal. And people believed him. But there was always people in the church that were there to buy his whiskey. So that's how he made his business over the years, and got caught in 1798. So we're one of the oldest distilleries in Scotland.
That is such. I love stories like that. Absolutely amazing. Hiding that in a church is such a great story. I'm curious because obviously there is a Viking influence
Yes.
on the brand. You mentioned it earlier, and also part of the repackaging, which we can hit into later. But his name, Magnus. So was Magnus like from Scotland, or was he from a Nordic country and had, or his family from a Nordic country? Or what is his history?
Yeah. So Magnus is okay in Orkney. When you look at the amount of people. There's a few called Magnus there, not in rest of Scotland. And Magnus basically is a Scandinavian name. We had lots of kings in Sweden and Norway named Magnus, and also in Denmark for that matter. Not kings, but Vikings. And going up through the years, it's been a very common name in Orkney as well due to the heritage. But Magnus were from Orkney. He was Scottish at that time, but his family probably came from Sweden. Magnus if you look at it, when I did some research some years back, and that time there was 14 people called Magnus in Great Britain, and 12 of them lived in Orkney. But there was more than 74,286 people, I think the exact number was, in Sweden with the name Magnus. And also Jönsson comes from the Swedish surname Jönsson. So it's fair to believe that Magnus was from a Swedish Viking family that came to Orkney, basically probably through some of the raids that the Vikings did, or moved over there back in the days, because the Vikings from basically Denmark and Norway came to Orkney around the year 800. They settled down, and it was under Danish Norwegian rules until it was Orkney was giving away to a marriage between the Danish Princess Margaret, and the Scottish prince, and that goes back to 1468. So a few hundred years after the Viking time, but it was still under Danish Norwegian rules and so on. Unfortunately, at that time, the Danish king had to pay a dowry to get his daughter married. He didn't have any money, or at least he didn't have the sum that the Scottish king wanted. So as a pledge, he gave away Orkney and Shetland, and the pledge was never paid. So Orkney and Shetland became Scottish in 1472.
Oh, wow.
And if you look at Orkney today, still 35% of the people living there have Viking DNA and can trace their family back to the Viking roots. So it's a big part of the Orcadian story, but we always have to look at it. It's not something that all Orcadians are proud of. And that's because we know that it's not a big secret that not all Vikings was just farmers or traders. Some of them did not behave very well, to be honest. That basically also led to one of the thoughts about should we move slowly away from the Vikings, because the stories that will be told around it is not always just the good stories. There's a lot of violent stories. And
Yeah. Violence has happened throughout the history of humanity in one way or another. The Viking heritage influenced the whiskey making process, besides just the branding?
Not so much in our core range, but in some of the special editions we have made over the years, yes. We made a series which became extremely famous and kind of changed a lot of things for Highland Park, called the Valhalla Collection, which was 4 different Thor, Loki, Freyr, Odin. The whiskey maker at that time was asked to reflect the gods. So we have to. I had to teach him about the Norse gods and talked about who was Thor. What was his personality, and try to make whiskey that way. So where Thor was this very, very strong man that solved problems and were a very respected god, then Martin Markvarsen at that time had to go in and make a whiskey that was very, very strong. And even though it was very strong, you would all love it because it was powerful but had some really nice notes on it. Where Freyr had to be a kind of a feminine whiskey, in the sense of still being strong because she was a strong goddess, but it became a whiskey, and basically the first whiskey where we ever used first fill bourbon cask as well. So a different type of whiskey, where Loki, because he was the one that fooled people, we had to find casks that were not exactly what you expected from Highland Park, but then at the end it was Highland Park. So things that changed, and where Odin was the one that stood out as, of course, the Almighty, All-Father, and were everything you expect from Highland Park and a little bit more. So at that time, yeah, we tried to make whiskey that you could identify with the Vikings, and then later came into it with Trout Retail, where we had the Viking collection, Viking Warrior collection, and kind of reflected the different names there as well in the best way we could. But in the core range, it's never had an influence. We're trying to make the 12-year-old as we did 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and still will 15 years from now. So, yeah.
So speaking of, I'm going to move on to this 15
Yes,
year.
yes.
Uh, I don't know if you're ready or not, or whether you have some with you, but
Well, I have, yeah, yeah. So I have the new label, but still, yeah. I have the 15.
can you walk me through the difference between the 12 and the 15? And then let's move into cast strength number five,
Yes.
because, going from really interested that you guys did use Viking heritage to influence, and I love the fact that you're using god names like Loki. That must have been a ton of fun, just even like
Oh,
coming up with that.
it was fun, and it was fun launching them as well.
I bet.
So
Did you
yeah,
dress up as Loki?
no, 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 I didn't, but we had Vikings that did, but I didn't myself. No, so the 12-year-old we had were matured in 20% first fill sherry season cars, where most of them were European oak. There's a bit of American oak in, but most of them were European oak. And then this one you have now, 15, is more American oak influenced, which will give you a bit more kind of tropical fruity flavor. I won't say pineapple because depending on how you taste pineapple there, but
I smell
more
cherry.
tropical. Yeah, yeah, and that's definitely there. There's dates, there's a bit of apricots as well. There's a touch of spiciness to it, but more kind of on the peppery side
Hmm.
compared to the 12. The 12 was 43, this is 44% alcohol. Um, and then there's a pretty nice kind of sweetness, vanilla sweetness at the end to it as well. The
Yeah.
peatiness and smokiness is the same as it was in the 12-year-old because it's the
Okay.
same, same spirit from the beginning.
The thing that
So
immediately when I smelled it on the nose, it just smelled darker.
yes, yeah, yeah, yeah.
So not
And
as
it's
bright, but
no, but it's the percentage of first fill casks. So even though it's a higher percentage of first fill casks, the American oak, and this is American oak that are used for sherry, not for bourbon. So this is American oak shipped to Jerez de la Frontera in south part of Spain, used for sherry casks there, and then we use them later for this. So very very different. And I need to say, because if there's people listening to this and think that's not doesn't sound like the 15 I have, we had another 15 on the US market that was discontinued in 2016, and that was a different cask makeup with more European oak, and we're closer to the 12-year-old than to this one here. And an amazing whiskey, but we discontinued that in 2016 due to the cars that we were using had to be used in the 18, and we didn't have stock enough for it. So, and then we relaunched this in 19 with a new cask makeup and 44%. So, but it's a very fruity whiskey and very delicate whiskey, and actually it's a whiskey that if you look at warmer days, this is a whiskey that really fits into these warmer days because it's a little bit more on the fruity side and malty side, and still a bit fresher, but also a little bit stronger. Yeah. So
I'm gonna take a sip of this real quick.
yeah, yeah.
And so first off, I wanted to hold it in my mouth for 15 seconds, but I figured that's a long, awkward silence in
Yeah,
what
no,
we're
no.
doing here. Um, but first off, right, like again, I from a spirit, I expect a burn right off the bat, and there was zero burn off the bat. It came probably like 6 seconds later,
Yeah,
and I felt like just the oil, a little bit of oily up front. And you're right. Again, like for me, very similar to the 12 in terms of there's not a lot of smokiness or
no, no,
peatiness to this at all.
no.
It's very complex. This is more
Yeah, yeah.
complex than the 12.
Oh, yeah, definitely, definitely, and probably also I would say the balance here is nice because there's nice touch of spiciness and sweetness that they don't really fight. They're just there,
Yeah.
side by side. And then when you have the fruitiness balancing or to the smoke, which gives you this kind of ideal balance as well. But there's a thing that I always like with this is that the creaminess or the oiliness that gives me there, together with vanilla, reminds me quite a lot of creme brulee, which is just nice with the burnt sugar on top as well. It's some of these things that I get for this as well.
Creaminess is a great word for it.
Yeah, yeah,
Because like oil for me is like probably not the most like tantalizing visual word, but creaminess is a great word to use for this.
yeah,
And yeah, I would 100% agree with that. And I'm trying to remember back, but I feel like the sweetness came up front and then the spiciness came at the end versus on the 12, I felt like this more subtle sweetness came near the end. But
yeah. You'll see, as you move up through the ages, the whiskey also moves a little bit further back on the tongue. It's not a proof and it's not science that it will do that, but it's just the longer it stays in the cask, then this creaminess, oily move a little bit further back on the tongue. And when you come to something like 54-year-old, we have, you don't really feel it around that kind of place on the tongue. It starts really warming up in your chest and
mm.
comes with all the flavors that comes back as a kind of a three-dimensional whiskey that comes back and serves you again. So yeah.
So how does number five, cask strength number five, one differ from these three, 12, 15, and 18? And then more importantly to me, I think, is what distinguishes number five from the previous expressions of the cask strength?
Yeah, well, to make a very long story short about the cask strain, we launched the first cask strain in Sweden some years ago. They, as you know, they have a monopoly there. They wanted it in 35 cl bottles. We managed to make 4 batches there, releases, 4 different releases over the years, and they were all different. And we thought, well, now it's time to move it into global. So release number 1 for the global kind of audience were a whiskey where we basically used the same type of cask as we were using our 12-year-old, just going into cask strength and using a bit more of the first fill cask to begin with, just to give it a little bit more flavor. So American oak and a little bit of European oak and a little bit of American oak and a little bit of refill at the end. I wouldn't say low in strength, but we were just above the 60. Moved up to cask strength 2, left the European oak a little bit in the back and more American oak inspired. Used more bourbon in release number 3. Then we came to release number 4, and this is where Gordon Motion thought, let's go a bit out of our comfort zone, and we used port wine casks. So there was American oak, there was European oak in there, but the majority of casks that lifted the whiskey was port wine cask. So here you get a little bit more kind of winery flavors, you get a little bit more sweetness, you get a beautiful kind of fruitiness at the end that plays around with the smoke. And 64.3% alcohol in that one. And I probably shouldn't say that because I'm afraid that I'm getting misunderstood. But it was so easy to drink at full strength. I wouldn't recommend it, but it was just easy to drink at full strength because it was so balanced and mellowed. So when people tasted it and they looked at me and said, it's not 64.3. And I said, well, it is. And we actually managed to measure it because there was a bar that had an alcohol meter to measure it, so the volume. And then something completely new happened when Gordon Motion, our master whiskey maker, wanted to make release number 5. Something we never done before. We've done port wine cask before in a whiskey we called Fire, but in cask number 5 we used PX cask, Peter Jimenez cask. So, you know, a really heavy sherry wine, a sweet sherry wine, and it gives you an unbelievable flavor. It's 64.7 and lingers around your tongue for a long time. Comes in with the raisins and these kind of things. Dark chocolate comes in. But one of the things that I always, when I taste it, and I just had it at a tasting last week here, if you leave it on your tongue, you can almost get this kind of licorice anise notes coming out on the side as well, together with the beautiful honey sweetness. And that was just unbelievable. What I always do when I have these strong whiskies, because I recommend to add water to it, but not to spoil my whiskey too much. I always take a good sip of the whiskey into my mouth and then very carefully take a glass of water and just sip the water while I have the whiskey in, and then mix it in my mouth. Then you actually get it, and you can see, is it getting better there? And then you can start with one drop in your whiskey afterwards. And I can tell you, it's one of these whiskeys that when you add water to it, you get more of everything. And we're talking 1-2 drops to start with. And it's a whiskey. If you could hold the one, Dan, you should give it an hour's time. Sit and kind of analyze it. That's what we call it professionally. Some will just say enjoy it, but first taste it neat and say, oh, fun. And then one drop at a time. Leave it for 2-3 minutes, and then sip it again and see what water actually does until you have it down to about, let's say, 50%. It's absolutely an amazing journey to see how much the whiskey changed. So yeah.
So when you say get it down to 50%, what does that mean?
That means that you will add water to it slowly, and that means one drop will only give it down to probably it's 64.7, but we'll probably take it down to 64.1. Another drop, a few 0.23% again, another drop, and so on, and then just see what that one drop do every time.
Yeah.
And it's an amazing journey to give it time and play around with the whiskey as well.
You're speaking the words to me, especially with some of those notes, and I'm gonna have to go and look to see if my local liquor store has it, because I'm super interested, and also, again, learning. I know about, adding water droplets and things like that, but I didn't think about like more than one or two, right? Like to see what that flavor profile change is.
Yeah, yeah.
So like doing like a drop and then experiencing that, and then another drop and experiencing another drop is I'm gonna have to try that out.
When we taste the whiskies in Glasgow, when we select cask and these kind of things, all the whiskies we're trying is 20%. And that is simply to release all the flavors. We're not enjoying it that way, but that's how you release all the flavors, and most important, the bad things that we don't want to have in the whiskeys. And that's some of the things that you can experience, not the bad things, but to see how whiskey will change. And that's the amazing thing.
Let's move because you got cask strength number 5 came out last year, or this year, sorry, 2024. You also have the packaging redesign that came out in October. It's a whole new inspiration. Like, what inspired that, and how has it been received? It sounds like to me, I saw some of it on the website, that it's more of a tone down of the Viking influence. Is that correct?
Yes. So
you're slowly moving away. Yes.
So this is the new packaging. This is the front label, and compared to the one you have, the 12-year-old, you can see that's black. There's the pattern on the bottle as well. Viking honor on it. Here, nothing about Vikings. Although we still have the amulet here. We have a little bit of a redesign, which I come back to as well. But what we want to show here compared to the Vikings. First of all, why did we move away from the Vikings? And that's due to basically two things. The understanding of Vikings around the world, as we talked about, very, very different. But also if let's say you're completely new into whiskey, you never heard about Highland Park, the first impression when you see a black label and a Viking pattern would normally be that might be a very strong, maybe even heavily peated whiskey. And it was hard to get people to try it if they were afraid of peated whiskey. So the recruitment process for us were a bit tough. And then we thought, is there more stories we can tell about the Vikings, or will it be too cartoonish, or have we told enough? And we thought it was about time. And even though I'm from Denmark and Viking family, I thought it's good timing now. I've been kind of searching for this for a while, because I think when you tell stories, let them be so people understand them as well. So now, when you look at the labels, it might be hard to see, but there's some heathery flakes or purple flakes, and that tells the story about the heather we have in Orkney, which is very sweet honey in the peat, and basically stands for 90 to 92% of the plant material in a peat. So what we're going to tell about now is that much more about Orkney itself, not the history, but about the craftsmanship that we have in Orkney, about the people, about the nature. And we are one of these distilleries that where we proudly can say that we are different by nature. Our climate is different, our peat is different, and so on. So there's a few things that makes us different. And it was about time. And then to go away from the Vikings is one thing, which I won't say we will. We will dial it down, because it will always be there and it will be mentioned now and again, but we will not tell a lot of stories, at least for now. And it's kind of the simplicity of labels comes out here, tells you that this is a single malt whiskey, it's Highland Park. And on the front label here for the 12-year-old, spicy and well-rounded. That's it.
Yeah.
Go for it. That's what we wanted. And then again, going into a bar, restaurant, a black label in a dark shelf in the back doesn't really stand out. The white labels do. So there's quite a few things without being too marketeers about it and talk about that. But I think the new look, and I'm not saying this because I'm working for Highland Park, because I was a huge fan of it from day one, and can't wait to come out and talk about it.
I think it looks amazing, and it also looks like the glass is simplified as well, which I think is because the glass is very, very busy. Like I look at it and I'm like, what is all going on here?
Yeah.
And the label looks classy as well. So like I think it looks great. Um, Something else to hit on is you all are doing a distillery renovation that started earlier this year. Is that correct?
Yes, we closed down 1st of April, and we're going into a renovation about going close to we transition into being net zero, and of course for a distillery that is 226 years old, that's not easy. But we do whatever we can, and by 2030, probably 50% there, and hopefully a long time goal will be to be, I wouldn't say 100%, but very close to 100% in 2045. So that means that new washbacks, we always had washbacks made of Oregon pine and Douglas fir, changed into stainless steel, which is, for our guys, it's easier to control, it's easier to clean, and it's where we can use different temperatures and so on, where you really can't do that in wooden washbacks. We have a new heating system, so we don't use coke or coal now, but use basically whatever we can in wind power, wave power, and all these kind of things as well. And even our cars at the distillery is now all electric. So we are going into a more sustainable future for Highland Park as well. And I think this is something that we have to do for the future as well. But basically, this is the first step. The biggest problem for us is that we are located in Orkney, and people will always look at, well, how do you get your cars up? Well, yes, they have to be transported, and they have to be transported back to Glasgow and so on. But that's something we've been doing for, as I said, 226 years, and it's not something we can change. Orkney is a remote island, and we are still making whiskey, and the only thing we can get cars back and forward is by ferry and cars, and that's just how it is.
Yeah. I mean, that's also, it's almost true for a lot of places. There's always some type of transportation happening to get product, no matter what industry you're in. But it's commendable of trying to go to net zero and thinking about sustainability because that is, I wouldn't call it a fad. It is the progression of the world and how we're trying to make sure future generations can continue to enjoy things. So great on you all. The when do you plan on the distillery reopening? I think it's like next year sometime. And what do you do for like if somebody wants to come and taste? Does that mean the tasting room is closed as well, or how is that going to progress?
No, we will start production in mid-January. Then there will be a few trials, a few weeks and maybe a month trials to see where the new make will go. So we don't put something into the casks that we don't really want, but the quality needs to be there, and that's up to a master blender, Gordon Motion. We'll probably open up for tours mid-March till 1st April, where we will open for the public. But remember, we have in Kirkwall, which is where Highland Park is located as well, we have our shop downtown where we now have a tasting room. So if people want to come and have a tasting of Highland Park, not a tour, but a tasting of Highland Park, we can definitely accommodate them in our shop, where we made some of the shop into a tasting room where we can do tastings and basically with everything we have from 12 and up to whatever people want to pay for, of course. So yeah.
Well, that's great. I want to talk about the 54-year-old release because you've mentioned it a few times, and I specifically definitely want to hit on this. You released it in 2023, if I'm correct, right? It is the oldest expression Highland Park has released, and 255 bottles to commemorate the 255-year anniversary. What does this release mean to you and the Highland Park and the significance of the story behind it?
First of all, I think it was a good year to find the casks. Of course, we find the cask a few years back, but it needed to be the age for it. 225 years is a long time producing whiskey, and to be able to come out with a whiskey that gives us the flavors that this had to celebrate our anniversary was amazing. It from the beginning it was tin casks that were laid down in 1968, and over the years they matured in refill casks until it was 40 years old. And then Gordon looked at them and said, "Well, it's really, really nice whiskey, but it need a touch." So he transferred them from the refill cask into to first fill sherry cask and matured for the last 14 years and became a whiskey that was, I would say, unexpectedly good, because sometimes when you come up to these 50 plus years, the whiskey sometimes becomes a little bit woody, and which of course is quite natural after 50 years in an oak cask.
Yeah.
But this didn't. And I tasted it blind when I was 53 years old. Gordon didn't tell me what it was. He just, I was down working with him, and he just gave me a glass and said, "Oh, please try this." And I tried it, and I looked at it and I said, "My God, this is probably the best whiskey I've ever tried." And I was almost, because of my passion to this, I was almost in tears and wouldn't let go of the glass. It was really, really a great whiskey. And then he said, "This is going to be our 54-year-old." This is just unbelievable. And I could see that when we launched it in London, the global launch we had there, I could see when people tasted it, they all looked at each other and they were basically speechless, because it was so much better what you expected, and an amazing whiskey. And we launched it in, the US launch was in San Francisco, where I was over, and the same thing happened here. People had a really good night. They had a few other whiskeys, and then when we came to the 54-year-old, there's always this kind of, what's going on now? What's coming? But when it came in and people tried it, the look in their eyes, they were all, they all went from being stone faced till suddenly a smile, like when you see your first love or something. It was just unbelievable. It's fantastic. So it means a lot to us. The whole thing, from the packaging to the story and these kind of things, all became one, and it was a fantastic journey to be part of as well. For me, it's a milestone, coming to the oldest whiskey. I've been part of launching the oldest whiskey from Highland Park ever. Is something unique as well, which I definitely look back on when one day when I retire in 50 years from now, hopefully. So, but still, that's it.
Yeah. You're going to celebrate with your own 54-year-old Highland Park bottle, right? I hope they give you one. Have you been able to taste it since that initial taste that you had blind?
Yeah. So I'm in the lucky position that I'm the one traveling around the world launching it. So I think, honestly, I probably tried it 25, 30 times. I normally say, when people ask me, I say, well, probably had a bottle myself, but close to it, because it's an honor. And the thing is, honestly, I have the same with the 18. I'm just as surprised every time I try it that it's that good. And it's one of the things that when you try a whiskey that really surprises you and do it again, it's just an amazing feeling. And that's the thing I have with the 54-year-old. I'm gonna launch it, not launching, but I have another tasting in March next year. There's 2 restaurants in Sweden that bought a bottle together and open it for the public, where people buy tickets to get it, and it's the same feeling to see people's face. And the excitement, because it's a long night where we start with 12, 15, 18, 21, 25, 30, 40, and then eventually, after 2-3 hours, the 54 will come out. And it's not like, people can't taste it, because it's 1 cl of everything they get, or 10 ml, and then they have a bit of water and food in between, and then when we come to this, there's been a good time in between before they taste it, but they're so excited, and then it comes in, and it's just to see people's face when they sip it and say, oh. So, and a good idea is always to give them the glass the 54 were in, because you'll be able to nose that whiskey for a week, 2 weeks after. That's how oily, it sticks to the glass. And so,
yeah, you want to like absorb it into a piece of cloth, kind of like a baby, with the lavender, and you go to sleep with it next to you at night.
No. So it's a real treat, and something that I'm very proud of to talk about. So.
I understand that there was a theft incident of a 50-year-old Highland Park bottle as part of a collection, and one, I don't think people realize how expensive a 50-year-old Highland Park bottle is. It's 39,000 pounds. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
And so, separate question: how does one buy a bottle? Like, can they actually? Are there any left? And can they actually I, as an individual, if I happen to have 39,000 pounds sitting around to spend, do I just reach out to the distillery and go, I need a bottle?
Yeah, no. So when we did the tasting in Seattle, we a couple of months ago, we actually had a dummy with us. So it was there behind Gordon, Motion, and I, and we talked about all the whiskeys and the story about Highland Park, and then at the end. We just talked about it, that this is the oldest whiskey we had, but this is a dummy. But of course, if you want to buy it, just get in contact. And there was a gentleman, basically 2, but there was one gentleman that stood up and came over and said, "Can I buy it?" And yeah, of course you can. And he got the contact from the guys from Edmonton, US, and next week he had the bottle at his home. So. There's a few shops in US that have it as well, but otherwise it's just to get in touch with the Edmonton group that can advise how you buy it. And I think there's still a few left, but not a lot. We had 225 bottles, and with the Asian market, the US market, the European market, it actually goes quite well. But there's a few left, as there should be for £39,000. But it's a whiskey, I really hope when people buys it, of course, there's a lot of collecting going on. But when people buy this, I really, really hope that one time we'll open it and see how good whiskey can actually be.
Enjoy it, right? Like those types of things should be enjoyed,
Yeah,
especially with people that you love. I'm surprised it's only 39,000 pounds, to be honest. If I were you all, I'd put it at 54.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So no,
I,
but it's good. It's really yeah, it's a treat. So yeah.
so speaking of treats, I want to move on to Highland Park 18. Um, so is this specific release the one that you love, or is it a previous release that is discontinued? I'm
No,
really curious.
it still keeps the quality and continues. So still today, my favorite Highland Park of all, if I could choose one to tonight, because £39,000, if I could afford it, I would probably buy that. But this is still affordable and will be my go-to dram. That's the 18, and has been since I fell in love with that. It's an unbelievable, complex and balanced whiskey, the 18-year-old. And talking about the difference between 12 and 15, we are up to using 40 to 45% first fill European oak sherry season casks here. So you get orange peel, you get raisins, you get dates again, but there's also things like nuttiness, marzipan, dark chocolate coming out, and it's potpourri of flavors, all kind of fruitiness and flowers coming out. And what I like the most when I taste this is when you get this, and you get it in lying on your mouth, on your tongue, and you let it go down very slowly. Then, if you wait a few seconds, you can feel it sneaking back in the side of your mouth and water your mouth again, slowly, but with new flavors. And I always call that the hallelujah moment, leading back to Magnus working for the church. But all these flavors comes back and just waters your mouth, and it just gives you a beautiful sense of Highland Park and peatiness and peat and everything that comes out. And this is the whiskey that Paul called that, had the whiskey journal. He turned out to say this is the best spirit in the world twice, and it's just a fantastic whiskey.
Wow. So I just took a sip of that. It is like a warm blanket on my tongue. It
Yeah,
is like no burn. I had zero burn, super smooth. When I was smelling it, I definitely got that bouquet. It was more like a smorgasbord. Like if I thought of somebody set up a table with all this good, delicious stuff laid out on it, the nose was going from one to another. I definitely orange, dark chocolate, and some others, which I'm gonna have to smell. Take a smell again. But wow, that is super super smooth. And you know what? I never had the thought, and I know some people love specifically Scottish whiskey for smoke or peatiness. I didn't get that at all. I honestly, I didn't even cross my mind when I swallowed that or smelled it. It was and again, it's not overtly sweet. It's super 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 nice.
yeah, no, and that's when you look at it, the spirit from the beginning is exactly the same spirit as we produced for the 12th, for the 15, basically for the 54. But depending on the cask we're using, and put them together, this is where you get the balance and complexity and all these flavors just combined in one. When you have a whiskey that have a bit of peatiness, like Highland Park, if there's other flavors like the nuttiness, can we find a balance so we don't really feel the nuttiness too much, but we don't feel the the smoke either. And the same with sweetness towards spiciness can be. So when you taste it, as you said, it's not too sweet, but it's not too spicy either. It's not too peated, but it's not too nutty either. It's just all these kind of things, and it's that's where you find a balanced whiskey, and that's what the 18 is all about. Is simply just balance and flavors.
I was going to say the word that comes to mind is balanced. Like there's
Yeah,
nothing overwhelming in any area, which I think for me makes it more interesting to uh, taste and experience because then, especially I can see with adding water droplets to it, you get to really experience the culmination of change
yeah,
through it, right? Like so, every time you take a sip, take a whiff, it'll be different. Super, it's my favorite out of these three, for
yeah,
sure. So.
yeah.
I'm excited to continue. I poured myself a little bit more generous pour on this one. Um, over your extensive career, 35, you mentioned maybe 36 now, years, what has been the most memorable experience or story that you could share with us?
Oh, damn, my God, there's been a lot. I think some of the crazy ideas we have had launching new products has been had led to some amazing trips and so on. To I would mention two. One was basically just when I began working for Highland Park, and we decided to make a trip called the Return of the Vikings. So we invited 67 Norwegians, Danes, and Swedish guys to fly directly from Stockholm and over to Kirkwall. And to fly directly, you first of all you need to show passport. No one did because we didn't went through passport control. That's not what they have in Orkney. But the thing was that I had a meeting with the pilot for this chartered plane 2 days before we had to leave, and he said, "Well, Martin, I've been looking at the plan for Kirkwall Airport and our flight, and the plane we have might be a little bit too big to land in Orkney. The runway is simply not long enough for our flight." And I looked at him and said, "So you tell me that 2 days before we have to leave?" And then he smiled and said, "But don't worry, I used to be a fighter pilot. I'll manage." And don't tell people that. So basically, we went on the plane. I did the highest and fastest whiskey tasting ever, according to Guinness Book of Records at that time. And then when we approached Orkney, he said, "Well, can everybody sit down and go into brace position?" And that's what we did. And then he flew down, so he was just a few meters above water. So when he could see the runway, he could hit the brakes right away. So basically, we almost touched water, and then the runway came, and then he hit the brakes, and we all managed. The worst thing were when we had to fly away, because again, the runway was not really long enough. So he prepared to not fuel it too much. But then we had a dinner the night before with all these guys, and we invited the captain and his crew as well. And one guy said to the other, "So what did you buy?" "Oh, my suitcase, I could only fit 19 bottles in." "Oh, well, I had 25 bottles." And that was every guy, around the table, between 15 to 30 bottles was what they bought. And then the captain started calculating, that's a lot of weight compared to when we flew over. So when we had to leave, he said, "Guys, I heard what you were talking about last night. I simply can't fuel the plane. I only have very, very few gallons of fuel on the plane, so we can only fly down to Aberdeen. But the good thing in Aberdeen, the runway is long enough, and we can get a fuel plane there, so we can fly back to Stockholm." So just by listening to this, if we haven't invited him, it might have gone wrong. So that's what we made it back. But then in 2014, we made the launch for a whiskey we called Dark Origins. That was all about Magnus Johansson and his Viking route. So we thought, what better way to organize this than to sail across the North Sea from Gothenburg to Kirkwall. And we did. And we sailed out. We were 3 members of the crew on board, then myself, and then 12 journalists. Now, I used to be in the Navy, so I'm quite sea strong. Sailed out, and when we reached the south coast of Norway, the Norwegian Coast Guard called in and said, we recommend you find a harbor because the weather in the North Sea will be the worst weather in the North Sea for 12 years.
Wow.
But our captain, he was quite a sailor, so he said, let's just continue. And he asked us all, and no one dared to say no, so we just continued. And it became absolutely mental. I've never in my life imagined waves could be that high. And then on a sailboat, you come up on the wave, and then you just fall down. So a trip that should have lasted 2 days took us 4 days before we could go into the harbor of Kirkwall. But that was quite an amazing. And the thing were, when we sailed in, I have pictures of that. There was a rainbow like a gate. When we approached, there was dolphins on the side of the boat, and it was just like a dream. And are we alive? Are we, and so on. And we came in, and of course we didn't drink on the boat for safety reasons. But when we came in, the first thing I did was to open a bottle of 18-year-old Highland Park and share it with the people around. And then of course I had to sail back. But at that time we had sailwind and the wind calmed down, so a tailwind. So we made it back as well. But I was the only one and the crew that sailed all the way back. But that was quite a trip. And then there's been a massive amount of launch. The launch we had for 54-year-old in San Francisco was incredible, in an old church, decorated, and with the best band I've ever heard live. And I've been to live concerts, but this band was just amazing, like a new Fleetwood Mac band, and it was just, again, a night where you had the Golden Gate in the background as well. So some amazing things over the years I experienced, and probably the day I retire, I will sit back and think back on what I've experienced, and maybe even write a book about how a lifetime work with as an ambassador could turn out to be. So yeah. So I was told the other day I'm the longest serving ambassador in the world for the same brand. So I have stories to tell about Highland Park and not all other brands. So yeah. So
You know what? I absolutely love it. Martin, I would read that book because this interview has been absolutely fascinating, from your beginning as a championship boxer who then found his way into the whiskey world. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you and diving into the world of Highland Park and getting to learn more about you and your love for whiskey. And the incredible stories behind it, because I'm sitting here as you're telling them and I'm like, I want to do that. And then at the same time, I'm like, I don't really want to like be in waves that big. And I can only imagine how sick I would be. But the ending sounds like that's the thing you never forget. And you're so grateful for. To our audience, I would love to ask and have you all respond down in the comments. What type of Scotch whiskey do you enjoy? Are there particular flavors that you love and resonate with you? And don't forget to like and subscribe and share this video with everybody else. Martin, absolute pleasure. Thank you so
likewise.
much for
Well,
sharing with us.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you.
All right. And until next time, we are out.